So what do you think of when you think of Valentine's Day? Do you think of love, Cupid, chocolates, candies, red roses? On February 14th, sweethearts of all ages will engage in what appears to be a harmless holiday that's rooted in innocent love. But is this modern day holiday really rooted in innocent love? Or does it have a much darker pagan origin that was later covered up by the Roman Church of its day? Is St. Valentine's Day a holiday that is really Christian and something that Christ would support today? Or is this an imposter holiday, designed by the enemy to be just one more distraction from the holidays on God's calendar, the holy days that really matter? I know, some will demonize me and tar and feather me for even suggesting that there might be something wrong with this holiday that supposedly is all about love. If you're a bit skeptical, I understand. Just hold on and watch this video till the end. Every bit of evidence will make a difference in coming to your own conclusions. Prophetically, the Spirit is beginning to speak to His people around the world and refine His bride. He's slowly but firmly and surely moving His people away from the religious traditions of the early Roman Church and bringing His sheep back into their pasture, into His true biblical calendar that brings true life. So this begs the question, should modern-day believers celebrate a Catholic-infiltrated holiday, especially if it's originated and has grown from the very dark roots that we're going to share in just a moment? First of all, as a believer in Messiah, anytime I see the entire world celebrating something, it always throws up a red flag. Christ said that wide is the road that leads to destruction and many take it. The world normally wants nothing to do with the roads that Christ paved. So it always makes me nervous when the entire world is on the same road, especially if it's a road that was paved by the Roman Catholic Church. After all, their history of taking very pagan festivals and adopting them into the church, throwing a little holy water on them, and calling them Christian is very well documented. So I personally needed to know for myself, was Valentine's Day the same or was it different? The first question I wanted to answer was, where did the name St. Valentine's come from anyway? Was it a real person? Was it a saint? At the end of my study, the answer was kind of. But before we go there, let's go all the way back in time to the most likely real beginnings of this popular holiday of, quote, love. And that means we have to go all the way back 600 years before the birth of Christ to the founding festival celebration of Rome called Lupercalia. Lupercalia was a pagan Roman festival that was celebrated from February 13th to the 15th. According to History.com, it was a bloody, violent, and sexually charged celebration awash with animal sacrifice, random matchmaking, and coupling in the hopes of warding off evil spirits and infertility. This cultic fertility celebration was dedicated to Lupercus, the Roman god associated with shepherds and fertility, as well as the legendary founders of Rome, the gods Romulus and Remus, who were alleged to have been nurtured by the she-wolf in the cave of Lupercus. Although you may not be familiar with the god Lupercus, you will likely be familiar with what the Greeks called him, Pan, that half-man, half-goat god that was the god of shepherds and is often affiliated with sex and fear, thus where we get the word panic from. Interestingly enough, the Bible often characterizes his people as sheep and links Satan to a goat. Furthermore, it's even more intriguing to learn that during the highest holy day of the biblical year, Yom Kippur, the high priest of Israel would bring the two sacrificial goats before God. One would actually be sacrificed, while the high priest would confess all the sins of Israel over the other, and then place his hands on the goat's head and transfer the sins to the goat. From there, the goat was led into the wilderness, called the scapegoat, and he was pushed off the cliff. This symbolic act was a way for the people to know that the God of Israel knew that the origin of all sin originally came from the serpent in the garden, which was now being symbolized as a goat. This entire founding festival of Rome is dedicated to none other than Satan himself, Pan. So let's find out what this Lupercalia festival was all about. It begins, of course, by sacrificial rituals performed by a group of priests known as the Luperci, who gathered at the sacred cave of Lupercal on the Palatine Hill where Rome was supposedly born. This was the very same cave that Romulus and Remus were said to have been suckled by the she-wolf to stay alive. Ironically, the Latin word for wolf is lupus, and the Latin for she-wolf, well, none other than the slang for prostitute. February was thought to be the month where spring began, and it was said to be the time of cleansing and purification before the gods. It was in the cave of Lupercal that the priests, called Luperci, would sacrifice 2 goats and a dog, symbolizing purification and fertility. The sacrificial blood was smeared then on their foreheads of who? Two naked young men, signifying a rite of passage and ensuring fertility. Then the blood would be wiped off using wool soaked in milk while the priest laughed. I believe all of this is for a reason. I believe Satan is creatively mocking here the goats of the Yom Kippur sacrifice and the blood of the lamb that was placed on the doorpost that caused God's people to be passed over during the fateful night in Egypt in the Exodus. Hebrews 9:14 says that the blood of Christ will cleanse our consciousness. The priest laughing at the wiping off of the blood, I believe, is Satan's way of saying that he's going to do his best to wipe the blood of Christ off our conscience and remind us of our sin. During Lupercalia, once the sacrifices were made, the blood would then be placed on these strips of goat skins called of all things thongs, or februa, which were the tools of purification. After a feast of much eating and drinking, the newly initiated and now drunk Luperci priest would run through the streets naked, striking as many women as possible with the blood-soaked leather goat strips. Young women would willingly bare their skin, welcoming being struck by the blood-dipped goat strips, believing the blood would cause them to be more fertile. Many sources report that this drunken and sexually violent festival also had an element that included a matchmaking lottery in which young men drew names of women from a jar. The two would then be coupled up for the entire duration of the festival. Although Lupercalia sacrifices were eventually banned in 341 AD, the festival continued to be popular throughout Rome until it was said to have been outlawed by Pope Gelasius at the end of the 5th century. Coincidentally, in the same year that he banned Lupercalia, he instituted Valentine's Day. Go figure.
What?
While Lupercalia was celebrated from February 13th through 15th, Pope Gelasius chose a saint that just so happened to be allegedly beheaded right in the middle of Lupercalia, February 14th. It seems like a perfect replacement to distract the carnal Christians of Rome who were easily entangled by the popular holiday that had been at the foundation of Rome's holiday calendar for over 1,000 years. But who is this supposed saint? Before we find out who Saint Valentine was, let's talk about another sketchy character, Cupid, the chubby little naked angel boy that supposedly shoots people with one of his arrows and they immediately are struck with lust, passion, and love for one another. While Cupid is the name the Romans gave him, his original Greek name was Eros, where we get the name erotic from. Contrary to what people believe, Cupid doesn't mean love, but actually desire, and more specifically, lustful desire. Originally, he was depicted as a handsome and naked young man. Over time, the image turned into a naked child who not only did the bidding of his mother, Venus, but paintings suggest an ancestral relationship between the two. His mother Venus, called Aphrodite in the Greek, was the goddess of sexual intercourse and desire. Interestingly enough, one of her main symbols was none other than the rose. It seems the red rose has a root that goes all the way back to the goddess of desire. Cupid's father is said to be Mars, the god of war, so all of this makes sense because it explains why he is the god of sexual desire, but also carries a weapon, the bow. Originally, Cupid's arrows were designed not for love, but were used in a devious way, to have the wrong people burn with desire towards one another, and that would lead them to chaos and destruction. Sound familiar? I believe that's exactly what Satan's doing with our young people today. Create a system of dating from a young age so that the children are, quote, coupled, filled with desire towards one another, almost always ending in chaos and broken hearts. So while in the feast of Lupercalia, the priest would put the blood of the sacrifice on the foreheads of the young naked boys that would then run throughout town, striking young women with their whips to induce fertility, Cupid is now the young naked boy that shoots people with his arrows to cause them to fall in love. The similarities are striking and cannot be dismissed. In my opinion, the spirit behind the mask of Cupid is none other than the demon of lust and pornography, trying to get young people to find boyfriends and girlfriends as early as possible, convincing them that they need to try out as many people as they can, and in the process, they'll be leaving their faith in God out of the picture almost altogether. When believers find a spouse in the same way that the world does, should it surprise us that we have the same exact divorce rate? To this end, it seems his poison-tipped goal is to create as many broken hearts as possible as he trains people in the art of selfishness. And all the while, he masquerades as a cute little chubby angel on the front of Hallmark cards, albeit a fallen angel, no doubt. So as believers in Christ, here was the first question I had to face. If Valentine's Day is such a Christian holiday as we're led to believe, then why on earth is the main mascot for this holiday a real Roman god that is for sure the invention from hell itself? You might have an answer for that, but I didn't. In the beginning of my research, I'm not going to lie, I told myself, well, that's not what it means to me. I don't celebrate it like the pagans did, which was exactly what I also said about Christmas and Easter as well when I found out the origins of those. But then he reminded me that it didn't matter what it meant to me because I wasn't the one being worshiped. It only matters what it means to him. No matter how excited I would be to get my wife a brand new bow for hunting, if she didn't want it, then I would be making it all about me. And that's exactly what I believe that we're doing in the church today. And I'm pretty sure God's about fed up with his kids making it all about us and what we want to do and how we want to worship him and all about how we feel. After all, Deuteronomy 12:32 says, "Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it nor take away from it." But you might be thinking, I'm not worshiping God during Valentine's Day. If you are, hold that thought. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. For now, let's find out where the person, Saint Valentine, actually came from. So now that we've nailed down the history of Lupercalia and Cupid, finding out the incredibly dark origins of those, let's move on to the last piece to this puzzle. Who is Saint Valentine? According to the Smithsonian, there were multiple Valentini that supposedly fit the description and died on February 14th in the 3rd century. Apparently we know this because there was an order of Belgian monks who were tasked over these 3 centuries of collecting evidence for the lives of saints for the church. It's from these Valentist monks that we know all that there is to know about these 3 supposed Valentine saints. And that's the problem. We don't know very much at all. The only thing we know about the first Valentinus is that he died in Africa with 24 soldiers. That's it. And the other 2, well, that's not much better. According to late medieval legend, there was a Roman priest named Valentinus who was arrested during the reign of Emperor Claudius II in the 3rd century. He was put into custody of an aristocrat named Asterius. The legend says that Asterius told the priest that he would absolutely convert if he could cure his foster daughter of blindness. So of course Valentinus proceeds to put his hands over the young girl's eyes, heals her. From there, Asterius and his entire family were baptized and supposedly converted. But when the emperor heard about it, he was furious and had Valentinus beheaded on none other than February 14th. The third candidate for St. Valentine, it's also a very similar story. He ends up also being beheaded by the same emperor. According to the notes of the Valentist monks, they challenged the authenticity and historical accuracy of these stories, and according to the Smithsonian, they're probably likely the same person with 2 different versions of what happened. There's also legends of St. Valentine performing Christian marriages while he was in prison and passing notes between Christian lovers that were jailed by Emperor Claudius. If true, the similarities of connecting lovers and the fertility ritual and matchmaking of Lupercalia could be the reason why Pope Gelasius chose this saint as an alternative holiday for the feast that he just banned. After all, with St. Valentine being killed during the pagan feast of Lupercal, this intimately connects the 2 at the hip in the most convenient way. So what do you think? Is it a convenience or is it coincidence? Even though some of the history of the Valentines are sketchy at best, what we do know for sure is that virtually all scholars believe the reinvention of all this love and romance that we see in Valentine's Day today was kicked into overdrive in the 14th century with the famous English author Geoffrey Chaucer. Pulling from some of the existing legends, he equated the feast of St. Valentinus to the mating of birds, of all things. He wrote this in the Parliament of Fowls. For this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every bird comes there to choose his mate. Apparently in Chaucer's day, English birds paired off to produce eggs in February. Soon after that, European nobility began sending love notes during bird mating season. The English audience completely embraced the idea of mating in February when Shakespeare's love-struck Ophelia speaking of herself as Hamlet's Valentine. Then of course came along Hershey's, Cadbury, and every other chocolate manufacturer to make sweets for everyone's Valentine. From there, the entire holiday became commercialized, evolving into what it is today. So while I personally believe that the Roman Church did exactly with Valentine's Day what they did with the date of Christmas, aka hijacked a pagan holiday that was infiltrating the church and replaced it with their own, the true motives of Pope Gelasius cannot be really known for sure. All we do know is that the motive to replace a popular pagan holiday with something that was church approved was definitely there. Number one, Christians were celebrating this pagan feast and he wanted it stopped. Number two, he outlaws Lupercalia and just so happened to institute St. Valentine's Day at the same time. Number three, he chooses a saint that just so happens to allegedly been killed on February 14th, which is right smack in the middle of Lupercalia. And lastly, number four, the church has already made such a switch in the previous century by moving the birthday of Christ from the biblical feast day of tabernacles, called Sukkot, which is in the fall, to the winter solstice of December 25th, when the Romans were celebrating the birthday of their sun god. All of this seems like it points to an evidentiary conclusion that Valentine's Day's origins are in fact pagan. And Pan, aka Satan, that goat god who's bent on making people look like him, half in the image of God, half in the image of the stubborn and rebellious goat, is at the head of all of it. At the end of the day, it's the trianalogy of good and evil. It's the compromise between good and evil that makes the whole thing evil. If you agree, hit the thumbs up button right now and put the word pagan in the comments. If you don't think that there's enough evidence to say it comes from pagan origins, then state your case in the comments as well. So at the end of the day, here's the question. Should we as Christians celebrate Valentine's Day? Ultimately, that's for each person to decide based on where they're at spiritually. For me, there were two components that helped me make up my mind. First of all, the scriptures are very clear that if there's any holiday that originally was set up for the worship of a foreign god, we cannot take that holiday, sprinkle some holy water on it, change it a little bit, and use it to worship the true God. God says in Deuteronomy chapter 12 that we cannot look into the ways that the pagans worship their gods, borrow from their ideas, and then worship Him likewise. Second, for those that have ears to hear and eyes to see, it's very clear what the Spirit's doing in the earth right now. He's calling His true bride out of Egypt again and separating them from the traditions and doctrines of men that have prevented them from seeing the full truth and experiencing His true power. After all, sometimes the greatest curse is the blessing that we don't even know we've missed. And by constantly introducing these imposter holidays, the Roman Church completely abandoned the real holy days of God, the feast days of the Lord that He gave to anyone and everyone that would choose to follow Him, the ones that foretold the first and second comings of Christ, which, by the way, is a major motivation of Satan to create these fake holy days so that God's people would miss the blessings that are built into them and never even know what they missed. It's not a coincidence that Jesus, or Yeshua in the Hebrew, dies on Passover, is put in the grave during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, raises on first fruits, and the Holy Spirit just so happens to come down on the Feast of Shavuot, better known today in the Greek as Pentecost. That's just the feast days of the spring that are all about His first coming. It should not be surprising then to learn that He's prophesied to come back on the Feast of Trumpets, when the original kings of Israel were crowned as kings, and why the dead in Christ rise first at the sound of a trumpet. Then Judgment Day will be on Yom Kippur, and the marriage supper of the Lamb is during the Feast of Tabernacles, when actually Yeshua was born.